here's how this came up. The thing that I wanted to talk about today, because Mark James, of course, my cohort and co-author down in Memphis, and Mark James Books and Memphis Wrestling History, and look him up on Twitter. But he's sold a couple of collectibles lately. He's like we all are. He sells some stuff in order to buy more stuff, and I do the same thing. And in this case, I got a few of the old Memphis Wrestling, Jerry Jarrett's wrestling company, paychecks from Mark that he had in his collection. And it's fascinating. Of course, I've sold the Smoky Mountain checks on my website for years, and they're almost gone, as a matter of fact. I think I might have about 3 or 4 dirty white boys, a couple Killer Kyles left, and that's pretty much it. But, from the days where Jerry Jarrett would do house cleanings every once in a while, that's how that old reel of a 2-inch videotape with the scaffold match with him and Don Green, which, by the way, is on the Louisville Tuesday Night at the Gardens book DVD combo. That's on that DVD, but the original 2-inch reel of videotape turned up on eBay because Jerry Jarrett would just give people shit. Here, haul his shit off. And then later on, they're selling the paychecks. So at any rate, when I started looking at those and I started thinking about what I knew and could verify about what I had made in wrestling, or what I knew from documents that I had or had collected, or other checks that I had seen, or it was something to verify. You know what I'm saying? It's not like, because a lot of guys that actually made big money in wrestling will a lot of times say, oh, we got fucked. We got fucked. We never made the money we should have. Well, they might not have made the money they should have, but they still made a lot of money, but they will downplay it. And other times, guys that probably didn't make a lot of money will go, oh, I made a fucking fortune. I made a goddamn, there's no way to judge. It's like the size of giants in the circus, or the size of, Russo's penis. There's no way to tell because no one's ever really seen the exact true measurements. But I'm sorry, I tickled myself with that one. In some cases, we do know, and factually, so it's interesting to see how that wrestling and the guys making money, and even some of the towns, the way that they drew or whatever, has changed. And of course, when I got turned on to the inflation calculator, we were just talking about this before the show, the usinflationcalculator.com thing, where you can put the money in 1952 or whatever, and it tells you what that buying power equals in the year 2017. Did I explain that fairly well to the people?
Yeah, I think that's pretty simple. It's an inflation calculator.
Well, there you go. It's for those people who know what that kind of thing is. They don't need any explanation. Anyway, I know everybody always says, goddamn Cornette, stuck in the past. And then I always come up with a reason why the past was so much better. But it looks like we're going to do this again. Today in professional wrestling in this country, and for the purpose of this exercise, I'm not taking Japanese wrestling into the equation. We know guys made big money in the 70s and 80s in Japan. The Road Warriors, Hanson, Brody, guys like that, 10, 12 grand a week or more as time went on. But this is just the United States, okay? And this is just what's verifiable, as I said, and we'll talk about how I can verify it as we go through it. And then we run it through the inflation calculator and see what it compares like today, when we know that the WWE guys make very good money, although actually the underneath guys, we've often heard by the time they pay their road expenses, et cetera, and they live their life on the road these days, not like the territories where at least you went home, or you worked every day, but you went home a lot. So, but the top guys make money. But is there any other? What's the biggest money that anybody outside of WWE in this country is making now? There's a couple guys in TNA that are still big ticket items, right? Or reasonably for that scale. There's Ring of Honor has signed a few exclusive contracts. I do not know what they are, but I would think if they brush into 6 figures, they're not spending much time there. Don't pull up no chairs. We can't stay in that neighborhood. Is there any, and we hear about the guys on the independents making big money in 6 figures these days, which would be low, I would think, low 6 figures outside WWE. Am I missing anything, Brian?
Well, no, I think it's a combination of things. Like you bring up Ring of Honor contracts. The Young Bucks have a Ring of Honor contract, but they also have the Japan deal. They do incredible on their merchandise, and they have permission to work a Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and I guess they may be able to ask for permission to work other dates outside of Ring of Honor. But so it's kind of a deal with one company, but it ends up being a bigger deal because they control their merchandise and they have the Japanese relationship.
And that's all very good, as a matter of fact. And I'd rather, as Don Knotts said in The Ghost of Mr. Chicken, I'd rather eat good food than bad food any day. I'd rather have control over my shit than not any day. So, yes, there are some guys, but I think we will also say that it's not epidemic across independent wrestling that the majority of independent wrestlers or even anything but a vast minority are making six figures these days in the United States.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. Well, let's go to what we know to be true. From documents that printed at the time, newspaper reports, from Jim Barnett, anecdotally, who was involved in Fred Kohler's Chicago office, which is where most of this information would be known, from papers in the Jack Pfeffer collection at Notre Dame that have been looked at, etc. We can pretty much say with certainty that the five highest paid professional athletes in the United States of America in the early 1950s, and then football was around, basketball around, baseball was around, but the five highest paid professional athletes in the United States in the early 1950s were the world heavyweight boxing champion and four professional wrestlers. And depending who was hot on the network TV out of Chicago at the time, one of them was Vern Gagne, because he was the United States champion on Chicago network TV, booked by Fred Kohler under the same deal, I think, as the NWA champion, which is what led to the problems with the NWA in Chicago and Fred Kohler. So he was getting a percentage of the gates, and he was easily topping $100,000 a year. Lou Thez, the NWA champion, everybody knows, got 10% of the house. He was topping $100,000 a year. Hans Schmidt, when he was probably the hottest heel of that era off the Chicago TV, one would think Gorgeous George, because same thing, wrestling from Hollywood, from Los Angeles, TV. He was getting a percentage for a while there. And we know Buddy Rogers made a shit ton full of money. But you know what $100,000 a year in like 1952, I believe is the year I put in, is equivalent to now?
No.
$924,000. These guys were literally at that point in time, and of course it didn't, it didn't last for 20 years like that, but during the let's say late 40s through mid 50s, with network TV and wrestling being hot in a variety of places, the guys that were making over $100,000 a year, and there were probably during that period, you can make a case for a dozen of them, including the ones I just mentioned, at one point or another made $100,000 in 1 year, almost $1 million. Baron Leone versus Lou Thez in 1952 in Los Angeles, which was the first, as we know, $100,000 gate in wrestling. They did $103,000 at Gilmore Field. That $103,000 a day would translate to $952,000 for a house show in Los Angeles. This is not TV rights, no pay-per-view. That's what they drew selling tickets. And if Thez got 10%, and I remember something, and I didn't even check, but something in his book that he may have taken a lesser percentage because it was going to be such a big show, but normally he got 10%, which means that he would have made $10,000, which would equal $92,435 for one match that night today. No pay-per-view, just a gate. But let's say he took half, which I know he got more than that. He took half what he fucking normally got. That would have been $46,000 for that match.
I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, and I don't remember it, but what percentage did Ed Strangler Lewis get as Thez's manager?
As a matter of fact, I believe, because at some points the 10% was 7 to Thez and 3 to the NWA. At some points it was 10 to Thez and 3 to the NWA, and they griped about that. The promoters did, because there was 13%. I think, didn't he give Lewis 1 or 2%, maybe one of his percentages and one out of the NWAs or whatever the fuck. But when Thez showed up at some points in that time and had the most legendary pro wrestler at that point still living of all time in his corner, they were, and the NWA booked them there, they were getting pretty much 15% of whatever you drew just to be there. And I think, and Thez worked everywhere. So That's and I mean, nobody, if we did nobody can tell for sure about these payoffs like Strangler Lewis and the guys in the 30s, and when there was betting money involved, and even the Frank Gotch or whatever. They got enormous amounts of money for the time for one match, but then they might not wrestle again for a month because they have to go in and do a training camp and travel on a train to another location or whatever. So it was a different animal. But those guys, Strangler Lewis probably made more money adjusted for whatever inflation of today than anybody ever in the business. I would say Jim Londos.
Yeah, that would be my pick.
But Lewis had the ability to, he was also in with the fucking Office, and he had the ability to strong arm a percentage for himself. And Londos was a lucky Greek performer. So there's the case to be made that Lewis may have made more money than Londos.
Although we don't have any idea how much Londos was paid for those big shows he worked overseas. Then when he went back to Greece and worked there and drew those stadiums full.
Oh, well, and but just even 30-something thousand people in Boston during the Depression. He was, if he got paid what he was worth by the promoters, he would have been up there. Anyway, continuing on. So we've established in the early 1950s, right, that's what and now this, once again, football and baseball and basketball were still around, but that's why guys like Wahoo and Ernie Ladd and so many other guys actually left football while they were still active to go to wrestling because they could make more money. The professional sports had not exploded, like they have now, and the payoffs are completely out of whack. Let me tell you, when I got into business, that's the Memphis territory that I know a lot about, and the checks that that kind of instigated this. I got a check from Joe LeDuc, or to Joe LeDuc from Jerry Jarrett. For the week ending June 1st, 1978, he made $898.75. The reason it wasn't $900 is because there was an occupational tax thing in Louisville at the time, and it was $1.25. So, and they would take that out, right? Whatever the fuck. And that's in a period that was just coming off of the end of May, Memorial Day, when business was actually down. Memphis that week drew 4,600 people, which was, obviously well below its historic average over time, and certainly wasn't 11,000 people sold out. The summer of 78 was not a strong business period for Memphis wrestling, even though LeDuc and Lawler got over to people remember it to this day. It just didn't click that summer. That was a long summer. So the top heel in the Memphis territory on a bad week made $900, which is today equivalent to $3,381. Now, I don't know whether he worked 6 days or 7 that week because it's not itemized. But this is in a down business period where Memphis did half of what it would do when any program was hot. And he made $3,381 in today's money for a week's work in the territory. Memphis alone probably would have accounted for 300 of that. So you can see that if Memphis had sold out, or if the territory was even hot, like it was at some other points, that could have easily been twice as much money, which would have been $6,600 fucking dollars. Wow. And you were home in your own bed in that territory 5 nights a week, and you drove every day, and it was hard. But here was another, for the week ending July 26, 1979, Jackie Fargo made $400. And that's deceptive week ending because he came in for Memphis. That was the WFIA convention, Jackie and Roughhouse Fargo against Wayne Ferris, Larry Latham, and Danny Davis. He came in for Memphis. He was flown in, put up in a hotel, got to hang out with all of his boys, go out and tear the house down in what was actually the best match of the night, and that included the Freebirds Memphis Arena debut and Hulk in the main event. And he got paid $400, which is today equivalent to $1,500. So that was, and then he went back to Charlotte to his place of business. Jerry Lawler, the week ending June 14th, 1979. This was the last week that Robert Fuller was the booker. When he was fired that week, and the next week they did the Tupelo concession stand brawl, right? Robert Fuller was fired because business was horrible and Memphis was at a low point of modern historical times with a $12,000 house. And Jerry Lawler made $2,508 that week because Lawler was such a draw. In Memphis, he was integral when Jarrett split from Goulas. He took Lawler, and Lawler was the key to getting Channel 5 television. Lawler was the key to, he was the guy that could draw 400,000, paid admissions a year in Memphis, Tennessee. He'd done it before. So he got 10% of the house, which alone, over a period, there was ups and downs in Memphis, but annually, that was probably worth $100,000 plus an average year. Well, Lawler's $2,508 that week, which was a historic rotten week for business, but because he had 10% of Memphis and was paid to work every other town, is equivalent to $8,462 today. And Lawler's $100,000 a year, approximately, give or take, who knows, if he had 10% of Memphis after taxes, today would be worth about $253,000 for working 52 times in one same building in your hometown. And I once saw when Lawler was passing out checks in Louisville, Christmas, it was New Year's week, actually. In Louisville at the Gardens, he handed me my check, and I turned around, and on his, because he always got this dressing room where it was kind of a private dressing room and had a mirror and a counter and a place to hang things and its own little shower. And I saw his check laying there, not in an envelope or anything, just on the counter, and it said $3,900 and something. And of course, mine was for I think $575, right? And he saw me see that, and he looked up at me and he said, "Hey, maybe if you're in the business long enough, one of these days you'll get a check like that." And I said, "Jerry, was that for last week?" And he said, "No, that was for last Monday." It was the Monday, the Christmas week Monday, where he wrestled Bockwinkel, and they pretty much sold out the Mid-South Coliseum. The house was $39,000. He got $3,900. 12 miles from his house for working on a Monday night, half an hour with Nick Bockwinkel. That would be equivalent to $9,900 today. So, and people wonder why Lawler didn't leave Memphis a lot. But Memphis was not and of course, not everybody did that. And I also got a Don Fargo check where he got $360 for 1 week in 1978 because he was just there. And a lot of guys made $300. But the point is, if you got over in a top spot and if you got to be a main event guy, you'd make money. If you got to be a main event guy and a booker, you'd make more money. And as you'll see, if you got to be a main event guy and a booker and got a percentage, then you'd make even more money than that. And it doesn't, once again, Joe LeDuc making $900 as a top heel one kind of so-so week in 1978. That could have been $1,500 or $1,600 or $1,800 if it was a record week. And that could have been twice that much if it was in a bigger territory with bigger buildings, drawing bigger houses. In 1984, Stan Lane and Steve Kern came back, and Jerry Jarrett did not like to give guarantees if people weren't worth it. But they each had a $1,500 a week guarantee, which is $3,536 today. Plus, they were selling gimmicks. And I don't know how they were doing then, but I do know that at their hottest, right before I became a manager, when I was still taking the pictures, the Fabs in the Tennessee territory, besides their wrestling pay, would gross up to $4,000 a week in pictures and T-shirts between the two of them, which is $9,837 today. So can you imagine? You're working in a territory where you're already both getting paid to wrestle, the equivalent of somewhere around $3,000, $3,500 a week, but you're splitting $10,000 a week in gimmicks also, and you're TV stars, and you're only in a hotel one night a week, and that's in Memphis where there's pussy hanging from the rafters.
Based on what you know here, though, in terms of the salaries or the paydays that the talent is getting, and whatever knowledge you know about what Jerry Jarrett's percent was for, let's say, a big show in Memphis, if you had to guess, how much was his take in, let's say, 1980, just to pick a year, what was his average week or, Memphis show? What was his take, and what would that be worth in current dollars?
Well, there's no way to tell because, obviously, and then there's, of course, there's the promoters always like to run things through the separator just to make sure, or contribute to the FIA fund, the fuck 'em in the ass fund, or whatever it may be. But if Jerry Lawler made $4,000 in 1 week in December 1982, which is equivalent to $10,000 in today's money, that's before he was a full partner with Jerry Jarrett, which didn't happen until spring of 1983. So I guarantee you Jerry Jarrett made at least twice as much money as Jerry Lawler did that week. I mean, he had a fucking 18,000 square foot fucking house built on 100 acres with a built-in ballroom in Hendersonville, Tennessee, which is actually after the housewarming. That's when Lawler fucking insisted on 50% of the company because he saw he was living in a goddamn mansion. If you were a wrestling promoter in those days, you were a millionaire, unless it was something that was just struggling to get by at that point. Maybe you had been a millionaire and weren't anymore because you were still in wrestling, possibly at that point. But
it was a license to print money. I mean, that's what you hear from a lot of guys. It was a license to print money to be a promoter.
Well, and in 1982, when I got started in the business, the minimum in the Memphis territory was $50 a night. That was your minimum. You were going to get that no matter how bad the house was, which is equal to $127 now. But still, a lot of guys would take that. And in some place, like in Carolinas, it was $60. In Kansas City, it might have been $40. I was just the second string manager, and Dundee used me fairly well, but I was underneath Jimmy Hart for a year in Memphis, and my best week there was $800 because I was on the big Memphis house where Lawler and Dundee had their loser leave town match. That was $300 of that $800 right in one night. But that $800 now for a mid-card manager, it was $1,967, and this was all on payoffs. Now, I'll tell you how they paid off here in a second. The $300 in Memphis was $737 that I just got for being on the underneath card on that show. And you talk about Jarrett as a promoter. The week of the loser leave town matches between Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee, I know it did $46,000 in Memphis. I was there. I think they did about 40 in Lexington, Kentucky. I wasn't there. I was in Arkansas somewhere. They did a big house in Louisville. They probably Jarrett Promotions probably grossed somewhere $10,000 or $20,000 either way of $130 or $140,000 that week, which would be $320,000 today. In 1 week in a territory in towns they ran every single week, except for Lexington that ran once a month. The way the guys were paid was any way that the promoter wanted to pay it, and who he wanted to take care of and what he needed to do and who he needed to make happy. But there was a legitimate formula. And it dates back to before television and back in the old days when professional wrestling was a live event thing that you paid the talent based on the gate, and the guys in the main event pretty much drew your whole house. That's how basic it was. And Sam Muchnick, I think, was probably the last one to use it. And that's because he started in the 30s and lasted till the 80s. But the deal was, and if Larry Matisic was here, he could probably do the percentages exactly. But it would basically, if you 100% of your house, right, after you pay your taxes, here's the gate from the house. You take a third for talent. 2/3 is for the rent and the advertising and the staffing of the building and the expenses of whatever the fuck and the promoter's profit and spaying the cat and whatever the fuck. But 1/3 of that house was supposed to go to the talent. And of that third, of that 33%, the main event, whoever was in the main event, and usually in those days it was a single match. And most often in St. Louis, the main events were single matches for the world title or just two top guys. Of that third of the house, the main event would get 60% of the third. So let's say that I can do in my head, let's say if it was a $100,000 house, just to make even numbers, and the talent was going to get $33,000. Well, right off the fucking bats, what's 60% of $33,000? Pretty much almost 20 goes to the main event, and then there's 13 or 14 left for everybody else on the card. That's why being a main event in St. Louis was so fucking prized. But that used to be the formula. And then if you were in a stadium or the Superdome or Gilmore Field in Los Angeles for Thez and Leone, the promoter may make some kind of deal, or he may just say, I took bigger expenses out, so fuck it, this is what you got. Because there was not a lot of apologies from promoters. There was plenty of, kid, you're farting through silk when you're working for me. Look where you'd be if it wasn't for me. But there was not a lot of apologies for the payoffs. But that was the formula. And then, of course, the semifinal match would get a bigger payoff than the opening match. And, the underneath guys might get a couple $100 a piece, whereas on a big St. Louis house, whereas the semifinal might get $1,000 or $1,250, and the main events would get $3,000, $4,000, or $5,000 depending on the house. So that was supposed to be the formula, but it got weirder as time went on. And then you could tell when you were in a territory for an extended period of time, you saw how they paid off. For example, we knew that whatever the house was in Tulsa, that was going to be the worst payoff of anywhere in Mid-South, because somehow Watts took some of his home office expenses or TV or just something. That was the home base, and Tulsa payoffs were the shits. Even if the house was the same in Jackson, Mississippi or anywhere else, you'd get more money than the same house in Tulsa. I don't know. But everybody had their own quirks, and you learned to kind of figure it out. And then once you worked there for a while, you realized you may not be getting paid what you're supposed to be getting paid, but you can kind of figure out now what you're going to get paid based on the houses, because you figure out the guy's proclivities. Mid-South Wrestling had a $60 minimum. That's $141 in today's money. The best week the Midnight Express ever had, $4,500 and something dollars, would be $10,600 today. And we were a tag team program working main events. So the money was being split 5 ways instead of 2 ways. Because JYD, the week, I believe it was probably the week of the Superdome with the match with Hayes, where they set the record. But when they did huge, strong business, and JYD was first hot, when we got there, the story was, and nobody was disputing it, that he had a $12,000 week that week. And that would equate, from 1980 to today, he would have made $35,673 that week for house shows in Mid-South Wrestling.
Wow.
And because a single main event, not a single guy like he's not married, but a single main event, there's only 2 ways to split the money. And then Watts went for package shows a lot, where he would consider 3 or 4 matches main events status, and he'd kind of futz with the money. But it was a Superdome house, so you're making more money you'd make if you were in goddamn, Houma, Louisiana. One day we went to Tulsa and Oak City for the last Stampede. We made $15 in Oak City and $750 in Tulsa, but $2,250 for the day would have been $5,304 today. And that was a week that we did over $4,000. Superdome or Houston, Texas for the last Stampede match, we had $2,000 a piece, $4,715. And that was split 5 ways amongst the Midnight Express of the Rock and Roll and me as a manager. But in Dallas, we know anecdotally, but it's after I worked there, I could see that they probably got fucked. But the Freebirds, that year they were hot with the Von Erichs, or the hottest year, made well over $100,000 each. And they were in the DFW Metroplex most of the time making it, which is equivalent to about $250,000 a day. So the guys in their early 20s, superstars on local television in Dallas, Fort Worth, making $250,000 a year. Hello.
Well, let me ask you this, though. Like, when you look at the money you made in Mid-South, obviously there's a difference between the money you make and the money you keep. Versus a place like Southeastern or World Class, where everything was relatively close to home. How much money would you have to spend? What were the expenses for being on the road so much in Mid-South Wrestling?
Well, see, that's the thing. Everything was so much cheaper, because I go back and I look at my books now, and I recorded everything for taxes, but our rate for hotels was in the 30s. Usually the boys had a rate because we were in towns all the time at some hotel, or the office got it for us up in Oklahoma, but it was like $32 for a Sheraton or $39. I think the Alamo Plaza in Shreveport, which was a dump, but we got it for like $25. And gas at that time was, somebody go look what gas was in 1984. I don't know, but it sure wasn't fucking $2.50 a gallon. And the only expensive trip was if you drove to Oklahoma, which that Oak City Tulsa loop was horrendous. If you drove, he would give you $125 trans money, Watts would, but which would probably be worth, let's say, $350 or $375 now. But if you flew and saved your body, it cost you about $250. Plus, you had to get a hotel stay over. So we always drove, but the expenses. I know the guys, and this is, once again, this is the territory days. This is pre-WWF national expansion, pre-contract. There's a lot of times guys had contracts and were making a ton of money and the company wasn't drawing anything, or the guys had contracts when the company was hot, but they had made a bad deal and weren't getting paid right. But these are payoffs. If we made this much money, you were assured that the houses were drawing more and the promoters were making more. and you know, as far as the guys on the national expansion of the WWF, road expenses started to eat them up, but you did not have to spend a lot of money in the territories to travel. At least you didn't have to. Some guys did, but you didn't have to. In the Carolinas, Charlotte territory, the top guys in the late 70s was not unheard of. If a guy had a really good year, he's going to make over $100,000, which is like $375 today. But this was one of 20 territories. It was the best one for work. You had to be Flair, Piper, Steamboat, Orndorff, Snuka, etc. level. But you could go there and you could make the equivalent of almost $400,000 or more a year and live in a territory. Ole Anderson, we talked about it.
Yeah, that's the one I was about to ask you about, because that's one of the more interesting cases. You bring up Lawler, why he didn't have to leave Memphis. Ole didn't have to leave Georgia and Mid-Atlantic, and he was making as much money as almost anyone.
He was booking, before he owned a percentage of Georgia, he was working on top as a main event guy and booking. So he got a main event pay, plus Barnett was of the old school and gave the booker a percentage of the town, maybe 3%. But 3% of every town you run, when you're running 6 towns a fucking night or a week, right? You're running 25 or more times per month. That's almost 300 shows a year. So between that and working in the Carolinas and a lot of the big towns, he and Gene, et cetera, his main event tag team, he had a few years. He made $250,000 a year then, which is $843,000 now. And once again, if you get to be a main event guy, you make money. If you get to be a main event guy and a booker, you make more money. If you get to be a main event guy and a booker and get a percentage, you make even more money. Bruno in the in the WWF, was it that, I can't remember, did he have 6% of the houses except for the garden where he had 5, or was it 5% except the garden he had 4?
I'm not exactly sure. I was going to say he had 6 and 3. So obviously, one of us was completely wrong.
Well, the point is, Bruno was so integral, and it's in his book somewhere, I believe, or somebody's book, but he had somewhere around 5% of every fucking town. And George Steele told me Madison Square Garden sellout in those days, in the 70s, was about $80,000, which would be $325,000 plus today. A payoff for the WWF championship, WWF championship match at a sold out Madison Square Garden, according to George Steele, who was a very honest man, he got $6,000. That'd be $25,000 today. With Bruno having a percentage of the WWF, there's almost no way that it could have been less than $300,000 a year or more. And the NWA champion, I mean, once again, we never saw the tax returns, but because of the percentage deal, and everybody's talked about it being the biggest break of their life and the most money, but they just couldn't keep it because of the schedule. But $250,000, $300,000 to be $1 million, $1.2 million today. Ray Stevens, and this is as anecdotal as it can possibly get, but I'll explain why I almost kind of believe it. He told me one time, he said in 1962 in San Francisco, when he was so hot for Roy Shire, he was making he made $150,000 one year, which would be $1.2 million today. But when you think about it, the Cow Palace was the hottest building in wrestling at the time, right? And they were selling out or drawing big crowds a lot of the time. If you had a $50,000 or $60,000 house at the Cow Palace and Ray Stevens is your golden goose, with knowing what we know about Lawler or Ole or the guys who were figured in on top and got pieces or whatever, or were taken care of. Even though Stevens told me Shire was supposed to give him a piece of the promotion and never did. That was the deal he made when he went out there. You can't tell me that he wouldn't give Ray Stevens $2,000 on a Cow Palace sellout of 50 or 60. One would think, right?
Yeah, that's reasonable.
Do that 24 times a year. That's 50 fucking grand twice a month. Just in one town, 50 times a fucking year. That's the guys these days, and I certainly today, make more money on average per shot than when I was active. Definitely. Because I don't do that many, and I never do any $60 spot shows anymore. And there were those in there also. But the repetition and the volume that these guys work, combined with the payoffs that they could get because of the multitude of towns and promotions, these guys that I'm talking about, there were top guys in every territory. And I'm not saying, I'll talk about the central states in a minute, but I'm not talking about the top guys in Kansas City. Still probably weren't making 50 grand a year. But there was other in the AWA, Nick Bockwinkel. He told me in 1982, he wasn't bragging about himself. He said the reason why he never left the AWA was because Vern did not run every night. He ran 4 or 5 days a week, maybe a couple of 100 days a year tops, and slow in the summer because it was slow business up there at that time. But the main event talent could still make 100 grand a year and have a nice quality of life, maybe more, which would translate to $250,000 a year 35 years later. So this, those guys, and it wasn't just Bockwinkel and Stevens, but whoever, Billy Robinson and who Mad Dog, I'm sure the Crusher used to make so much money that he would get mad at Vern and take off a season just because he wanted to go fucking fishing or whatever. So there were all these territories, and there were underneath guys making $300 a week, opening the show, jerking a curtain. That translates to fucking about 1,000 or 1,200, and plus working every night with top talent, so you get experience. And I'll tell you, in 1984 in Mid-South, the opening match guys had runs where they made $1,000 a week when the Rock and Roll and Midnight were hot or whatever. Let me see. Going through a couple of these other figures just real quick. Crockett. The Midnight Express 1 week made $4,600 a piece. Me and Bobby and Dennis Condrey, because the Rock and Roll and Midnight and Flair and Dusty double main event thing were hot, right? And when I went to get my check that week from the old office on Briarbend Drive in Charlotte, and the secretary hands it to me, they're typing out the checks as we speak. They still did it by hand in those days. But there's, once again, I'm in the right place sometimes. Sitting on the top of the desk is Ric Flair's check for that same week we had just worked, where we sold out Cincinnati and did a big house, I think, in Richmond or wherever the fuck. We made $4,600. Guess what his was for?
12.
You cocksucker.
I got it.
$12,000 and something. I didn't want to stare, right? But $12,000, and that wasn't Starrcade, that wasn't Great American Bash, that was no pay-per-views, TV specials. That was a week of house shows where Flair wrestled Dusty, and Dusty was the booker, so I guarantee he made more. That our 4,600 translates to 10,280. That the 12 grand or more translates to 26,819. Starrcade 86. I do know for a fact that the Midnight Express and the Road Warriors got $10,000 each for the scaffold match, and I guarantee you that Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, Nikita Koloff, probably Tully Bland Tully was 85.
Dusty worked with Tully at Starrcade 86.
Okay, Dusty, probably Tully, Nikita, and Flair probably made more than that, but our 10 grand's worth $22,349. And that was closed circuit, but remember, no pay-per-view yet. The $22,960 that we made in the month of July 1986 for the Great American Bashes translates to $51,315 for a month's work. It was hectic, though. And I guarantee you, once again, Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, and these still, we had contracts at that point, but this was still payoffs. These were not guarantees. Flair, Dusty, the Road Warriors, Magnum, and potentially a couple other guys made more than that.
How much were you guys paying again to Magnum after he got hurt? Didn't all you guys have money taken out of your check each week to go to Magnum?
Yes, I think, was it $40? Because we started it with Darso when he blew his knee. And one of them's reprinted in my Midnight Express scrapbook, but I think it's $40. But see, everybody, what originally was done was that Crockett had told us about Darso, that he was going to be out for like 8 or 9 months. And everybody liked Barry, and he had just got there, and he had wife. And I think they were about to have a kid or had a kid. So all the guys got together and said, we'll take something out of our check. And Crockett agreed that if everybody wanted to take $40 out, that he would match the total. So you had 25 guys take $40 out. That was $1,000. And then Crockett matched it. And so Darso got a check for $2,000 or whatever. Maybe it worked out to $1,500 or $2,000 while he was off to take care of his family. And then the same thing with Magnum. Everybody universally went, hey, let's do the thing we did with Darso. And so he got that for, I think, until Crockett sold the company, I believe.
Wait a minute. So I didn't realize it was that long.
I don't know why nobody would have said stop.
So from the end of 86 up until the fall of 88?
You know what? No, when he came back to do TV announcing or something, once that he got to where he could come back and work. But I mean, it was probably a year. But once he got to where he come back and work, I think they discontinued it or whatever. It's probably Crockett said, we're not going to do it any more than any of the boys said, hey, we don't want to give Magnum any more money. But anyway, but that was just one, because, everybody was doing well there. In another territory, I don't know, in Continental, you mentioned the short trip territories. Continental, it was like Knoxville. Guys could go and make $800 or $1,000 a week if you were on top, and 3 or 4 if you were underneath in those days, which, as we've said, triple that for today's money. But you could be home every night, and you could lay on the beach every day if you wanted to, or short trips. But then a lot of times, if you got a chance to go to the big territories you always wanted to see if you could hang, with the really top talent and go get a spot where you could make a name. And then you'd get more money when you went back to that short trip territory, if you were a bigger star from somewhere else. Oh, let's in St. Louis. Here's what I want. The St. Louis, we know for an absolute fact, because I have pages of the ledger book. And don't ask me how I got them. I'd have to kill you. But we went through all the other stuff. But I mean, and we've mentioned tons of different names. It wasn't like this was just a few people. And we won't even talk about how much fucking money Dusty Rhodes must have been making when he was working programs with Superstar Graham in Madison Square Garden and on Atlanta TV and in the Omni and the top star in Florida at the same time. Just ridiculous. In 1977. But Sam Muchnick with the formula that I gave you, right? This was I got some from his last year in business, and then some from the St. Louis Wrestling Club. The year that he retired, they were still kind of carrying on the traditions, and the town hadn't gone to shit yet because Sam had just retired. But in October 1980, Harley Race versus David Von Erich was a main event on a sellout or large house in St. Louis for the NWA World Title, right? Guess how much they both got paid that night?
What year, 1980?
1980. For a sellout in St. Louis NWA title match. Okay. And both guys would get the same thing, see?
Right. NWA title match, St. Louis, both guys, same thing, 1980. I'm going to go with $4,600.
$5,222. Which is $15,523 today. That's for a house show, folks. And the St. Louis Wrestling Club was not a territory. It was a one-city promotion. They had the local TV. There was an institution. They ran every 2 weeks at Tequila Auditorium, sometimes the big shows at the Checker Dome, or later became the arena that seated 17,000. But they got the underneath talent. Guys on that show, that same show that those guys got $5,200 for, the opening match guys got $200 and something because they were the opening match, and they were from fucking the Kansas City territory that drove there, and they were paying their dues, and it made their week because if you were in Kansas City at that time, you were probably making $350, and that's with St. Louis. In June 1981, Harley Race versus Ted DiBiase, St. Louis NWA World Title. Take a swing at it.
81?
81.
I'll go, I mean, if that was 52. I'll go with maybe 56.
Well, you're almost right. 5390, which equals 14,524. And you see why Flair used to love to fucking main event St. Louis, because he could fucking leave town and still have some money. February 1982, Flair versus Dusty, NWA title. I think this may have been a Checkerdome event, no, you know what? I believe this may have been the Sam Muchnick retirement show that they paid on. I don't know. Anyway, it was a big show in St. Louis. No TV, no pay-per-view. The big house show, Flair versus Dusty, $61.87 each, $15,705 in today's money. That was for the Saturday night of their 6 or 7 day work week schedule that week. So what do you think? Flair made 30, 35 grand that week, maybe potentially.
And spent it all the same week.
Well, what's more important is the St. Louis Ledger sheets also have, besides Sam Muchnick, the partners in St. Louis were Vern Gagne, Harley Race, and Bob Geigel, right?
Yeah.
So periodically they would take checks from the St. Louis Wrestling Club for their profits. And here in a space of 2 months, in February 1982, Gagne took $11,430 and Geigel and Race both took $12,722. In April, Geigel took another $68.50 and so did Race, and Gagne got $59.18. The point is what they drew in a 2-month period just as their profits as promoters, while they still have their own full-time schedule. Obviously, Harley Race is just making big money as a wrestler all over the world, and Vern Gagne owns his own company in Minnesota. But basically, Geigel and Race got the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money just out of the St. Louis Wrestling Club in a 2-month period, and Gagne, because he had a little bit smaller percentage, he had to make do with only about 45,000 from that one city. And a couple more statistics before I go. Now that I've made everybody cry in their beer, why do these fucking people think that I talk about when wrestling used to be big and when everybody used to be able to could make money and when there were fucking shows that drew thousands and thousands of people every night of the fucking week in every town in America? In 1984, just in Mid-South Wrestling, which once again, as a side, even though we did record business that year, we got hot, size of territory ranked behind the entire AWA, the entire WWF, probably Jim Crockett Promotions, although we probably outgrossed Crockett that year, but overall. So it was one of the bigger, but not the biggest territory. There were 4 towns, just four towns that 5, 7, 8, 7 did $10 million. Oak City, $10 million in today's money. Oak City in 1984 grossed $1.25 million. Houston grossed $1.15 million. New Orleans grossed $1.2 million. And Tulsa grossed $700,000. So that is basically about $4 and change million in 1984, but it's $10 million today. For those 4 cities for 1 year while they were running, and believe me, we all know it's one thing we know about Bill Watts. He literally ran every night of the week. So just 24, 48, just 72 nights approximately in those towns drew $10 million in today's money, plus his regular full-time territory. And people, once again, wonder why I get so distressed at what has happened to the wrestling industry.
One of the interesting things that all of this talk makes me think of is you brought up Ray Stevens and the money he made in Flair. And, when you talk about Gagne, making that money in the early 50s, Antonino Rocca was right there making that kind of money too. Just how many guys?
God, yeah. Well, no, wait a minute. Rocca was earning that money, but he had, by the time they split up 125% of him, I don't think he ever saw it, but he was earning it.
Right. But I guess my point was going to be that it's amazing how many guys in the territory days made amazing money and didn't hold on to it.
Well, that's true also. But now, here's the thing, and there's all kinds of asterisks to go along with that also. For one thing, that was gross. You had to pay all your expenses. You had to pay your own income taxes, et cetera, et cetera. For another thing, if a guy had a hot run or two, but all of a sudden then he couldn't get booked in a good place for whatever reason, he might spend the money that he'd made. Frank Morrell had a great line one time. Buck Robley was booking Kansas City, and he called Frank and asked Frank said, "Do you want to come out and be one of my top heels?" And Frank said, "Well, Buck, how much money might I make?" And Buck said, "Well, Frank, I made $300 last week, but that was for working and booking." Huh. Frank said, I don't think I can afford to work for you, Buck. It's kind of territory. You went in a fucking $20,000 Lincoln and came out on a $60,000 Greyhound. But the key to making money in wrestling, besides the things I mentioned before, which was, be the top guy or one of the top guys, get some leverage on the promoter, like when Ernie Ladd and Billy Graham and Ivan Koloff strong-armed Vince Sr. pay us all three the same because we're your three top heels. So regardless of who's in the main event, we're all main event guys. You get that kind of pull, or then you get to be the booker, or then you get a percentage, or get to be an office member. But also, to make money in wrestling, it was not a big hot run and then it was good, steady, top money for as long a period of time as you possibly can. That was the way to make money in wrestling, and then it could be done. And then if you saved it, even better. If you didn't, well, and I mean, unfortunate things happen to people. Not everybody blew their money, but even if you were hot, for a string for 20 years, and then that was 30 years ago, you've had to do something between now and then to, keep your status, or elsewise it probably didn't last that long. But once again, the one thing I always see Bruno Sammartino seems to have lived very comfortably, and I'm proud for him because, you would want that for a guy who not only was one of the most over guys of all time, but one of the biggest box office attractions, and made incredible money for 25 years and left pretty much on his own terms.
And then a lot of those guys from the 50s, so many of the major stars who were making big money became the promoters. Of course, Vern, the Sheik, the Bruiser came along a little bit later, but he was an instant sensation in wrestling. Eddie Graham. I mean, so many of these guys ended up with that license to print money, while other guys like, Dr. Jerry Graham, who again had his own excesses to deal with, or Antonino Rocca, Ray Stevens, if you look at the 50s and 60s, made incredible money for periods of time, but unfortunately didn't really have much to show for it.
And if you look back, the guys that made the big money and then became the guys that ran everything were not necessarily the best workers, but they were the best psychologists. They were the best guys with finishes. They were the best guys that understood how the business got put together. And when there weren't territories per se in the 30s and 40s, there were booking offices. And there was a Nashville booking office, Nick Goulas and Roy Welch, and there was a St. Joseph, Missouri booking office, and there was a Charlotte booking office, Old Man Crockett. The Crockett's lasted for 50 years. And there were local promoters in each town, and you had a choice of getting your local guys, and then you get maybe your better known guys from the area booking office. And then when network TV came along, then all of a sudden you could have those kind of talents, but you could also have these guys that people are seeing on TV every fucking night in their homes, and wrestling is the huge thing. So you got the Gorgeous George, or you got the fucking Hans Schmidt, or you got the Vern Gagne, or whatever. But when, as all things do, that network TV thing ran its course, the guys that had really made a lot of money, all of a sudden, the quicker than it was normal to make money in wrestling, were able to go back and either buy into their hometowns or steal them, as the case may be. And so the network TV boom of the early 50s really is what's responsible for the formation of the modern territories. Because once they made enough big money, and once the people had seen them and they could be a star and they had the money to invest, guys like Vern Gagne, et cetera, went back home and, like I said, muscled in, bought in, whatever, became the top star locally, became the promoter, became the booker, whatever. And they prospered from it for the next fucking 30 years. But then through the 70s, it was still very possible for a wrestler to get involved in as a promoter or ownership of an office. And we talked with Ron Fuller about his family. They'd trade ownerships. Lester wanted to live in Georgia. He'd trade half of Florida to Buddy Fuller, and they just move or whatever the fuck. And you could get points. And that's how Georgia was foiled when the Briscoes finally got points, and so many other people they could, after Ole forced Barnett out, Barnett orchestrated them forcing Ole out. But once that the TV networks and the publicly traded companies and everything got involved, that's when, and right really in the early 80s with the whole expansion thing, when things were falling apart, first you didn't want to buy into a wrestling promotion because you didn't know what was going to happen. And then it became impossible to. And if you notice to this day, except for independents, and bless them, Jeff Jarrett's probably the closest one with Impact / TNA / Global Force, whatever, of a wrestler actually being involved in an ownership position. John Cena 40 years ago would have had a piece of the WWE, and imagine what that would entail now. But now that's why they've nullified it's come see the show now. Come see the Holiday on Ice. Come see the Harlem Globetrotters. We don't know if Metal Arc's going to be on the team. I've used that one before. It's not the attractions, not the two names in the main event. It's come see the show. They've nullified the guy's leverage, and they made it impossible for the boys to buy in. That's why still to this day, so many of the guys, when they hear this guy's going to start a company and he's going to give the guys ownership or he's got benefits or blah, 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 they're smoking the hopium. And they want to believe that because that's the way it was traditionally done and everybody made a fortune. But it hadn't been done that way since the 90s started, and it can't be done that way anymore because the big budget shit you can't afford to buy into because it's corporate and they don't want to give the boys a piece because they don't want to give them any leverage. And if it's not a big promotion, of which there's only 1 3/4 maybe, you don't want to put your money in fucking wrestling promotion. You'll lose it. So that was, believe me, I was terribly offended because I had thought in 86, 87, 88, my gosh, in the next 10 years, wherever I'm fucking booking, I'm going to be able to buy into blah, blah, blah. And with OVW for a while, I did own my hometown, and I actually made money here, unlike Smoky Mountain, which dropped some. It's a different story. But it's almost impossible now. Like you said, it used to be a license to print money to be a pro wrestling promoter. And now usually they're the promoters are the last ones to get paid. So the whole fucking wrestling business, not only the boys and the talent and the matches, but even the promoters have turned upside down. I don't know what to say. How do we close that fucking bit?
When you brought up Cena earlier, it reminded me of a quote, and I'm probably going to misquote it, but Mickey Mantle years ago, someone asked him about free agency in baseball, which didn't exist when he was one of the biggest celebrities and stars in North America playing for the New York Yankees. He basically was, here's your contract, and that's what it was. There was no negotiation. They said, what would it be like for you today if there was free agency? And he said, well, I'd sit down with George Steinbrenner and I'd say, hi, partner. And
so there you have it. From the early 50s, over the last, say, 65 years, it's gone from the 4 of the 5 highest paid professional athletes in the United States of America were professional wrestlers. Wrestlers were making more money than pro football players, pro baseball players, pro basketball players, almost anybody else on earth, to now making much less money than pro basketball players, pro football players, pro hockey players, pro baseball players, pro boxers, pro MMA fighters, and pretty much everybody else. It has gone from, holy shit, we're making a fortune, to in 65 years.